Welcome to Chapter 3. This chapter is titled Research in Psychology, but it mostly focuses on ethics. So, the first half of this lecture is going to look at ethics kind of in a broad way through the general principles and standards that we need to keep in mind as we're conducting our research. And then the latter portion of this lecture will focus specifically on the guidelines provided by the APA that we have to include and adhere to in our research. So let's dive right in. So we are going to start our discussion on ethics in psychology research by looking at perhaps one of the most famous controversial experiments done in psychology. And it was conducted by Philip Zimbardo, who you see there on your screen. This experiment has been turned into movies and documentaries and talked about in tons of classes, but certainly intro to psychology and social psychology. So you may have seen or heard of this experiment before, but it is called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And the reason it is so controversial is because there is quite a bit of ethically questionable behavior that is allowed by the researchers, and also that takes place by the researchers themselves. So what I would like for you to do as you watch this upcoming video of the Stanford Prison Experiment is write down all the examples of ethically questionable behavior that you spot. You could just do this on scratch paper so that we could have a discussion about it. You're not going to be turning it in, but I do want to just see if you kind of have an intuitive sense of what is ethically questionable behavior and what is not. So just as kind of a fair warning, there is some language in this video that is sexually aggressive. There is language in this video that is explicit in terms of cuss words and its content. So this is the video that was put together based on the actual footage that was recorded during the experiment. So I think it's important to leave that stuff in so that you could really get a feel for what was going on in the Stanford Prison Experiment. So if that type of content is disturbing to you in any way, maybe you could just read about the experiment instead of watching the video. There's no nudity or anything like that, just some language that is explicit. Okay, so we are going to watch it now. Take some notes of anything that you see that's questionable in terms of ethics, and then we'll talk about it after the video.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
Hey, I don't want anybody left. Violation of the rules, I'm under simulation! I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I want out! I want out!
I've never screamed so loud in my life. Never been so upset in my life. It was an experience of being out of control.
I just fucking can't take it.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room, if anything else, because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. All the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses. And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of their humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards as a category are people who have power over others, in this case, power over the prisoners.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
I
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis. Like Milgram, Zimbardo was interested in the power of social situations to overwhelm individuals. His experiment would test people's responses to an oppressive regime. Would they accept it or act against it? Zimbardo's experiment was conducted against a backdrop of civil rights activism and protest against the Vietnam War.
There was a sense of student power, student dominance, and student rebellion against authority in general.
It was from the student body that Zimbardo selected his participants. After passing tests to screen out anyone with a psychological abnormality, they were paid $15 a day. Each was randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner.
It was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state.
I was 20, and that September I was going to college, and it would be nice to have a summer job, but there sure wasn't a lot of time left. And I looked in the want ads, and I found this thing which was just going to fit. It was just 2 weeks.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a job to keep these people in line, you really become that person. Once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick.
I was on summer break from my first year in college, and I was looking for a job. Had to choose between that and making pizzas. That sounded like a lot more fun.
As well as running the experiment, Zimbardo took on the role of prison superintendent. He began by briefing the guards.
I said, you have to maintain law and order. If prisoners escape, the study is over, and you can't use physical violence.
You can create a sense of fear in them. You can create the notion that their life is totally controlled by us, and that there'll be constant surveillance. We have total power in the situation, and they have none.
Prisoners were brought to the basement prison, blindfolded, to confuse them about their whereabouts. They were stripped and deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's a start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
When I first got here, even though I had to strip, when they would call me names, I still didn't feel at all like I was in the prison. I was just looking at it as a job.
I recall sort of walking up and down the very short hallway, which was the prison hall, and looking in on the prisoners, and they're basically lounging around on their beds. I felt it was like a day in summer camp.
The first day I said, this might be a very long, very boring experiment, because it's conceivable nothing will happen.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
On the second morning, the prisoners had decided to stir things up as well. The guards found some of them had used their beds to barricade their cell. Prisoner 8612 was one of the ringleaders of the rebellion.
Initially, I was stunned. I didn't expect a rebellion because not much happened. I mean, it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against, but they were rebelling against the status, rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students.
As punishment for the rebellion, prisoner 8612 was put in the hole, and the guards turned on the other prisoners.
The guards felt that they now have to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you little punk, you big shit, and so forth. And the guards got furious.
Everybody out! Come on,
Well, gentlemen, here it is time for count.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up in a line and have me hurl insults at them and make them do exercises. When you interrupt people's sleep, they tend to become a little disoriented. And since there was no daylight in the prison, they had no idea whether it was night or day. I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment. Zimbardo responded not as a psychologist, but as a prison superintendent.
I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally. And in return, all I would like is some information from time to time about what the prisoners are doing. So essentially I'm saying I'd like you to be a snitch, an informer. And I said, think it over, and if you still want to leave, fine.
Confused, prisoner 8612 returned to his cell and told the other prisoners that no one could leave.
He believed that we wouldn't let him go, although we've never said that. But the fact that he was the ringleader of the rebellion, and he told the other prisoners, they won't let you leave. And that really transformed the experiment into a prison.
I was told that I couldn't quit. And at that point, I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
Soon after returning to his cell, prisoner 8612 started showing signs of severe distress.
God damn it! Fucked up! You don't know! I mean, God! Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I just fucking can't take it.
He came up with a plan that if he acted crazy, we would have to release him.
I feel so fucked up inside. I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside. Out now!
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming and, you know, whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, you know, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
The boundary between reality and make-believe was to become blurred even for Zimbardo. A rumor circulated that released prisoner 8612 would return with friends to liberate the remaining prisoners.
I quickly convinced myself that, you know, my most important function was, you know, not to allow this prison liberation to occur. And what can I do to keep my prison going, not the experiment going?
The prison was dismantled and the prisoners moved to another part of the building. Zimbardo waited in the empty corridor, preparing to tell 8612 and his friends that the study was over, when a colleague appeared and began asking questions about the scientific basis of the research.
I'm trying to get rid of him. Then he says, "What's the independent variable?" I get furious because he doesn't understand that there's a riot about to take place, that this prison is about to erupt. I had totally lost this whole other identity of scientist, researcher, psychologist.
The rumored jailbreak never materialized. The guards had dismantled the prison for nothing and had to rebuild it. They took their frustration out on the prisoners.
They escalated again the level of control, the level of dominance, the level of humiliating behavior.
"819 was the next prisoner to rebel against the harassment of the guards. He barricaded himself in his cell and refused to take part in the count.
You're not only not getting a cigarette, but for as long as the cell's blockaded, you're going to be in solitary when you get out.
For 819's disobedience, the guards made his cellmates do mindless work. This undermined any vestige of solidarity amongst the prisoners, who now chose to accept the tyranny of the guards rather than risk further harassment.
That was one of the surprising things to me, is that there was so little that the prisoners did to support one another after we started our campaign of, you know, divide and conquer.
Isolated and distraught, prisoner 819 told Zimbardo he wanted to leave.
While I'm interviewing 819 and saying, okay, you know, it's all over, thank you for your participation, you know, I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early, he hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
And he said, I can't leave. And he's crying. And he says, I can't leave. I said, what do you mean you can't leave? He said, no, I have to go back, because I don't want them to think, you know, that I'm a bad prisoner. And that's when I really flipped out. That in such a short time, you know, a college student's thinking could become so distorted. I said, you're not a bad prisoner. You're not a prisoner. And this is not a prison. And it was this thing where he opened his eyes. It was just really like a cloud being lifted.
Seeing things clearly, prisoner 819 reverted to his original request and was released. To replace him, the experimenters called in one of their reserves from the standby list.
I got a phone call saying, "Are you still available as an alternate?" Kind of cheery female secretary voice. I said, "Yes, sure." And so she said, "Could you start this afternoon?" And I said, "Yes, sure." And my role in the experiment really began. I was blindfolded and then stripped and supposedly deloused.
He came into a madhouse, full-blown. All of us had gradually acclimated to the increasing level of aggression, the increasing powerlessness of the prisoners, the increasing dominance of the guards. And he comes in and says, what's happening here to the other prisoners? And they said, hey, you better not make trouble. It's really terrible. It's a real prison. And he says, I'm out of here. I don't want to. And they said, no, you can't leave. Once you're here, you're stuck. This is a real prison.
416, you got your hands in the air. Why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein. You stand here.
Prisoner 416 was soon subjected to the harassment of Dave Eshelman, nicknamed John Wayne because of his macho attitude.
416, I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
I made the decision that I would be as intimidating, as cold, as cruel as possible.
I love you, 293.
Get up close. Get up close.
I love you, 293. I love you, 293.
You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups.
2, 3.
I just watched a movie called Cool Hand Luke, and the mean, intimidating, Southern prison warden character in that film really was my inspiration for the role that I created for myself.
Why is it you try to be obedient so much?
It's my nature to be obedient, Mr. Reginald.
You a liar. You a stinking liar.
He was creative in his evil. He would think up very ingenious ways to degrade, to demean the prisoners.
What if I told you to get down on that floor and fuck the floor? What would you do then?
One of the best guards was also on that shift, and instead of confronting this bad guard, the sadistic guard, essentially because he didn't want to see what was happening, he became the gopher. He would go out to get the food and things of this kind, and that left the John Wayne guard and another guard on that shift to be dominant.
We were continually called upon to act in a way that just is contrary to what I really feel inside. Just continually giving out shit. It's just really one of the most oppressive things you can do.
416, while they do push-ups, you sing Amazing Grace. Ready? Down. Keep going.
Grace.
Keep doing push-ups on your own.
The madness of the experiment started to affect prisoner 416.
A wretch like me.
Keep going.
I began to feel that I was losing my identity until finally I wasn't Clay. I was 416. I was really my number. And 416 was going to have to decide what to do.
Prisoner 416 decided to go on a hunger strike.
They were pushing my limits, but here was a thing that I could do that could push their limits. After I had missed a couple of meals, I saw that this was not a matter of indifference to the guards. I was making headway. They were upset.
I thought, how dare this newcomer come in and try to change everything that we had worked for the first 3 days to set up, and by God, he's going to suffer for that.
Get in that closet then.
Frustrated by his continued defiance, John Wayne threw prisoner 416 into the hole. After punishing the other prisoners for his disobedience, John Wayne encouraged them to vent their anger at 416 directly.
Thank you, 416.
Okay, 209.
I'll try that myself. Thank you, 416.
We would use our nightsticks to bang on the door, and we would kick the door so hard that, it must have, shaken him very seriously inside, scared the life out of him.
He yelled at me and threatened me and actually sort of smashed a sausage into my face to try to get me to open up. But I didn't have any intention of eating until I was out.
416 should have been at some level a hero, because he's willing to oppose the authority of the system. In fact, the prisoners accept the guards' definition of him as a troublemaker.
I remember some of them saying, would you eat, goddammit? We're sick and tired of this. And, that was proof that, there was no solidarity, there was no support between the prisoners.
While 416 was still in the hole, John Wayne made a final attempt to break him by giving his fellow prisoners a choice. They could vote to release him by making a small sacrifice.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now what would it be?
I'll keep my blankets.
What will it be over here? How about 5486?
I'll give you my blanket, Mr. Correctional Officer. You don't want his blanket. We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3, guess 1. Keep your blankets. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
The study showed that power corrupts and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of abuse to stand up and defend themselves. Why doesn't anybody who is being abused by a spouse or something like that just say, stop it? And we realize now that that's not as easy as it sounds.
By the end of the 5th day, 4 prisoners had broken down and been released. 416 was on the 2nd day of his hunger strike, and the experiment still had another 9 days to run. At this point, a fellow psychologist visited Zimbardo's basement prison and would witness the brutality of the experiment firsthand.
The guards had lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet, had bags over their head, chains on their feet, and were marching by. And I looked up and I saw this circus, this parade, and I said, hey, Chris, you know, look at that.
I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just, you know, I just turned away. And I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, and then we had a big argument. You're supposed to be a psychologist. This is this interesting dynamic behavior in such a few days. I'm going through this whole thing, the power of the situation. She says, no, it's that young boys are suffering, and you are responsible. You're letting it happen. I said, oh my God, of course you're right.
The next day, Zimbardo ended the experiment. Studies like his stimulated heated debate about the ethics of using human subjects.
Clearly, young men suffered, verbally, physically. Prisoners felt shame in their role, guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
In the wake of experiments like Zimbardo's and Milgram's, ethical guidelines changed, introducing greater safeguards to protect participants. In the Stanford experiment, Zimbardo might have spared his volunteers distress had he not taken on a dual role in the study.
If I was going to be the prison superintendent, I should have had a colleague who was overseeing the experiment, who was in a position to stop it at any point, or I should have been the principal investigator and get somebody who was going to be the prison superintendent. I realized that was a big mistake, to play both those roles and be shifting back and forth.
After the experiment, Zimbardo brought all the participants together to talk about their experiences. John Wayne would now come face to face with the hunger striker he had tormented.
I was a little worried. I said, oh my God, he's really going to come down on me hard now, now that we're on equal footing.
It harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. Because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do.
When I look back on it now, I behaved appallingly. You know, it's just horrid to look at. I think I tried to explain to him at the time that, you know, what you experienced and what you hated so much was a role that I was playing, that that's not me at all.
I love you, Jordan.
He was trying to dissociate himself from what he had done. That did make me angry. Everyone was acting out a part and playing a role. Prisoners, guards, staff, everyone was acting out a part. It's when you start contributing to the script, that's you. And thus it's something you should take responsibility for.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could...
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
Why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start flashing back.
If I have any regret right now, it's that, you know, I made that decision, because it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had I not decided to to force things. It could be that I only accelerated them, that the same things would have happened, but we'll never know.
If the extreme nature of Dave Eshelman's behavior tested the prisoners, it also presented the other guards with a choice, to intervene or not.
It surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. They just accepted what I said, and no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
There were a few guards who hated to see the prisoners suffer. They never did anything which would be demeaning of the prisoners. The interesting thing is none of the good guards ever intervened in the behavior of the guards who gradually became more and more sadistic over time. We like to think there is this core of human nature that good people can't do bad things and that good people will dominate over bad situations. In fact, one way to look at the Stanford Prison Study is that we put good people in an evil place and we saw who won. Well, the sad message is, in this case, the evil place won over the good people.
It did show some very interesting and maybe some unpleasant things about human behavior. It seems like, you know, every century, every decade that we go through, you know, we're suffering the same kind of atrocities, and you need to understand why these things happen. You need to understand why people behave like this.
There's a similar experiment starting this Tuesday night on BBC Two. Details coming up next.
All right, so some of the ethically questionable behavior that students have mentioned in the past that I would agree with is the idea that Zimbardo himself acted as the prison guard. I think that was one of the most egregious offenses because he was obviously no longer able to be objective, and that bias hindered his ability to protect the participants within the study. Also, I think that it was obviously a problem when he suspected that he kind of might be outed, Zimbardo, for having the prison experiment or the conditions within it. And so he attempted to kind of conceal what was going on by moving the prison around. So I think that was obviously an issue. If you have to hide what you're doing because you are in fear that people are going to tell you what you're doing is wrong, then it's probably not something you should be doing in research. And there are countless other examples of ethical issues that you probably saw in that video, and we'll be referring back to the video throughout the whole lecture today and kind of mentioning those other examples of ethically questionable behavior. And you know, when this prison experiment was done, it was before we really had these clear outlined general principles in terms of ethics in psychology and the social sciences. So experiments like the prison experiment and another one we'll be watching coming up, Milgram's experiment, there wasn't really a governing body to make sure that participants were being treated ethically. But now there is, and in part because of these types of experiments. So two organizations that govern over ethics in psychology are the IRB, which is going to be a local institution like a university that receives a grant, and the other organization is the APA, the American Psychological Association, which exists for US and Canada. So ethics are not black and white. There is a lot that exists within the gray area, and so it requires a person to be able to make sound judgment in terms of what is going to be ethical in research. And to help a person use their best judgment, we have these general principles that all researchers should follow. And so we're going to go through these general principles that are laid out by the APA. So principle A is beneficence and non-maleficence. And so for beneficence, what we're really saying is that when we're doing research on participants, we want to try to maximize any potential benefits for that participant. So perhaps through taking a survey, they're able to gain some self-awareness. And that would be a really basic example of beneficence. But maybe if you're in the medical field and you want to try out a vaccine, hopefully that vaccine will provide beneficence in the sense that it is hopefully giving immunity to whatever disease the vaccine's trying to fight. And then researchers should also adhere to the principle of non-maleficence, which is the attempt to minimize any harm to the participants. We don't want them to feel upset as a result of our research. We certainly don't want them to be physically hurt in any sort of way from our research, but also psychologically, emotionally, we want to try to minimize any potential harm that could occur because of our research. Principle B states that we should always keep in mind the fidelity and responsibility that we have to our community as researchers. So what that means is that in terms of fidelity, that just means that people should be able to trust us as researchers and that we are expected to have a responsibility to our community and our colleagues and the people that we study to be doing our very best research that is ethically sound and valid and reliable. So in all forms of the word trust, that the participants can trust us during the research, that the results that we come up with and interpret and publish or discuss are accurate and truthful, and that the intention behind all of it is to improve the lives of the individuals in the community and enhance the field that we're doing the study in. So psychology, sociology, whatever social science it may be. Principle C says that researchers should always act with integrity, which means that the researcher must be truthful, they should be accurate in their observations and in their reporting, they should be objective and fair in the research process. So like we talked about with Zimbardo, he was not successful at maintaining integrity during the Stanford prison experiment because he became subjective when he acted in the role of a prison guard. Or a prison warden. It would have been better served if he had had someone else serve in that role, and he could have been kind of the primary investigator from the outside looking in, rather than actually being a participant in the research. And these ethical conundrums are going to kind of arise throughout your career if you end up in a career in the social sciences like psychology or whatever. I know for me as an IO psychologist, I've had organizations hire me and ask me to give positive evaluations of programs that they're doing rather than objective, real actual feedback, not just kind of feedback that's politically motivated or because the person has a financial interest in getting promoted if the program does well or whatever. So even if it's not research, even if it's acting in the field of social sciences, psychology, or whatever, we always have to maintain integrity. And if someone hires me to give an evaluation, I need to make sure that I give an objective and truthful evaluation and not one based on what just the client wants. Because that ultimately kind of hurts the reputation of IO psychology. It could hurt my own reputation as a consultant. So in those situations, it's always really important to just be clear up front that you will not lie. If you're hired to do an evaluation as a psychologist, you're going to give an honest evaluation. And so we always want to make sure that we're putting integrity first and being really clear with our participants, or in my case with my clients, that we will not lie and that with our research, and that we will always be straightforward and maintain that integrity. Principle D focuses on justice. So justice is the researcher's own limitations and biases are not allowed to result in people being treated unfairly. So we always have to keep that in mind. It's good to try to gain self-awareness as a researcher so you can recognize those blind spots, those unconscious biases, and then not let it kind of seep its way into the research and the way you treat the participants. People need to be treated equally and not discriminated against in any way. I'll have examples coming up of when Principle D was violated in research, and the outcomes are just terrible. So we need to make sure we're adhering to all these principles. And the next principle is Principle E, which kind of piggybacks on Principle D, which is the respect for people's rights and dignity. So during our research, we cannot cause harm of any kind. We especially need to be mindful of that if we're dealing with special populations like children, disabled, mentally ill, etc. But we always want to make sure that we put ourselves in the position of the participant and that we consider how we would feel if we were participating in this research. Would we feel a sense of dignity, or would we feel like those basic rights are being violated in any way? So we just need to be mindful of all of that and make sure that we're always treating people with the utmost respect. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit more specifically about the ethical standards that kind of are derived from the general principles we just talked about. And so we're going to go through these individually, and I am going to be giving you the excerpt from the APA manual on exactly what the expectations for these ethical standards are for each of the bullet points that you see on the slide there. So we're going to talk about competence, human relations, privacy and confidentiality, and then the ethical standards for research and publication. And you need to keep in mind that you are going to be doing research on human participants this semester, and so you too need to adhere to these ethical standards that we will be discussing. Okay, so the first ethical standard is competence. And so you can see on the slide here from the APA manual, it says psychologists provide services, teach, and conduct research with populations and in areas only within the boundaries of their education, training, supervised experience, consultation, study, or professional experience. So basically what that means is that we need to know the limitations of our competence and act accordingly. We really only should be doing research on an area that we are pretty familiar with. We don't want to do research on an area that we know absolutely nothing about and haven't researched at all, because this could be harmful to the participant themselves, the field of psychology, and the researcher. So we want to make sure that before we start our research, we always read literature to familiarize ourselves. The more we can read, the more competent we will be in the subject matter. And then, of course, if you are going to be working with a special population, any population really, but especially a special population, you want to know about any pertinent information, cultural information, any needs that they may need accommodated, or any unique limitations or issues that they may have as a result of being from the population that they are from. So we always want to be considering our level of understanding and competence when we're going into research, and making sure that we are as informed as possible and we're kind of staying in our lane. Like, I'm not going to be doing any research on advanced neuroscience because I really only know the basics, and in order for me to do research on advanced neuroscience, I would need like another degree to be kind of competent enough to do that. The next ethical standard we're going to focus on is human relations. And there's a few subtopics under this umbrella of human relations that we're going to be discussing. So human relations, that ethical standard is just referring to the way we relate with our participants, and specific things that we want to avoid. So the things that we want to avoid are unfair discrimination, harassment, harm, and we want to make sure that we avoid conflicts of interest and are not exploitative. So we're going to be discussing those kind of subcategories of human relations now. So we're going to start with unfair discrimination, and the APA says that in their work-related activities, psychologists do not engage in unfair discrimination based on age, gender, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status, or any basis prescribed by law. So we have to adhere to the laws in terms of discrimination, and we need to make sure that there is no bias or favoritism or prejudice or unfairness in the way we go about conducting our research. So what you wouldn't be able to do is give white males extra attention or help in a study, but not people of color, because that would be discriminatory and racist. So these are the types of behaviors that we need to avoid in our research. I know that this sounds probably like common sense, but actually, until pretty recently, there were some very racist studies that were going on within our own country by major organizations in the government. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment for an example of unfair discrimination and what we are not to do in research on human participants.
In 1932, the medical community still did not know a whole lot about treating syphilis. This was the case despite documentation of the disease dating all the way back to around when Columbus made his famous jaunt across the Big Blue. According to the Oxford Journal, syphilis was a cultural embarrassment and had many different names that exemplified prejudices of different nationalities. The German and English called it the French pox. The Russians referred to it as the Polish sickness and the Poles as the German sickness. The Japanese called it the Chinese ulcer. In the 16th century, Europe experienced a syphilis epidemic, which was likely caused by the abundance of sailors traveling from seaport to seaport and doing what sailors do when they come into port. In fact, there is some evidence that points to Columbus and his crew being the ones who brought syphilis back from the New World. Anyway, despite the disease being around for 4 or 5 centuries, there was not one true successful treatment for it. One popular remedy for several centuries was the use of mercury, which is actually quite poisonous in its own right, and people would either ingest this or rub it on the skin. This led to the popular saying that a night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury. In 1908, Japanese scientist Sahachiro Hata, working in Germany, discovered the drug Salvarsan was somewhat effective as a treatment for syphilis. It was also quite toxic as it came from the arsenic family. There were instances of patients losing limbs after taking this drug. Eventually, in 1912, Hata and Nobel Prize winner Paul Ehrlich developed an easier-to-administer but still toxic drug called Neosalvarsan, which became the standard treatment for syphilis until the late 1940s. In the early 20th century, the United States Public Health Service, PHS, was in charge of monitoring, identifying, and figuring out ways to treat ailments, diseases, and conditions that were impacting all U.S. citizens. They were divided into divisions, with one division completely focused on venereal diseases. In 1957, this particular division would be transferred over to the Center for Disease Control, CDC, but in 1932, the PHS covered sexually transmitted diseases. Between 1929 and 1931, the Rosenwald Fund, an organization that promoted the education and healthcare of poor African American farmers, sponsored a study with the PHS to identify the southern counties with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. Their original intention was to identify and treat the disease. Macon County, Alabama, had the highest rate, with over 35% of the male population infected with the disease. By 1931, the Great Depression was at its height and the Rosenwald funds were short. Despite the need to continue research, the Rosenwald Fund stopped operating in this capacity. So the PHS approached the Tuskegee Institute about forming a research group in order to study the effects of untreated syphilis on a black male population for a duration of 6 to 9 months and then follow up with a treatment plan. The institute agreed, along with the head of the university's hospital, Dr. Eugene Dibble. The study during the first year was led by Dr. Taliaferro Clark. The PHS enrolled 600 Macon County men, 399 with syphilis and 201 who weren't infected. They would be a part of the study. None of the men actually knew what the study was for. They were lured in with the promise of free healthcare, something that none of them had, and also the treatment of bad blood, a general localized term that encompassed several different afflictions, including anemia, fatigue, and other venereal diseases. The men were told that they were going to get free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. For those who actually had syphilis, they were never informed of their diagnosis nor given any treatment for it. Additionally, very painful and unnecessary spinal taps were performed on many people in the study. It was said that the reason for the deception was that it would be the only way the men would stay in the study, and the researchers, they wanted to closely observe the course of the disease over a large sample size to see the effects as the disease progressed, even to death. But not to worry, because as long as the ones that died allowed autopsies to be performed, their funeral expenses would be covered. It was actually not an uncommon practice at the time of taking
taking the government's consent in medical matters rather than the individual's. But in part, the deception seemed to result from the lack of respect that the doctors had for the men's intellectual capabilities. Most were illiterate, which the researchers thought was helpful as it would be harder for the subjects to figure out what was going on. There were also less than subtle hints of racial prejudice. For example, in a letter to a colleague, Dr. Clark wrote that these Negroes are very ignorant and easily influenced by things that would be of minor significance in a more intelligent group. Dr. Raymond Vonderler was the on-site doctor of the study. He actually supported partial treatment for the men for the sole purpose of making sure they remained in the study, years in, stayed alive. He was the one who actually gained consent for the men for spinal taps via letters that he sent to them. They read, "You will now be given a last chance for second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished, you will be given a special treatment if it is believed you are in condition to stand it." The study was initially only planned to go on for 9 months, but it went on for well beyond a year and then, due to breakthroughs, was extended beyond that. In 1934, 2 years after the study began, the first major paper was published detailing the health effects of untreated syphilis. By 1936, according to the CDC, a medical paper was published criticizing the treatment plan for the men. 1940 brought efforts to hinder the men in the study from getting treatment ordered under the military draft effort. You see, about 250 of them had registered for the draft and been found to have syphilis and ordered to be treated. In 1928, a Nobel laureate, Alexander Fleming, discovered penicillin. 1930 was the first recorded medical use of penicillin to treat infections. After penicillin was used to treat the survivors of the Boston Cocoa Grove fire in 1942, it became the medicine of choice for the United States military for infections. By 1945, penicillin was the accepted treatment for syphilis. Despite this, the subjects of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments were never administered or offered penicillin as a treatment. The study administrators wanted to watch the progression of the disease as the men got sick and, in many cases, died for the 40 years that the study went on, even though for much of it a relatively effective treatment was available. All total, it's estimated that 128 of the men died either directly from syphilis or complications related to it. 40 also infected their wives, and in some cases possibly others, and there were 19 of the men's children who were born with congenital syphilis. Finally, on July the 25th, 1972, Gene Heller of the Associated Press broke the story that uncovered the truth about the study. A government panel ruled that the study was ethically unjustified and ended it. In the summer of 1973, attorney Fred Gray filed a class action suit on behalf of the men against the PHS, and it ended with $9 million, which is about $50 million today, being handed out to participants as settlement. And now for some bonus facts. In a similar study, this time to test penicillin's effectiveness in treating syphilis and other STDs, researchers led by Dr. John Charles Cutler, who was also involved in the Tuskegee experiments from the United States, funded by the Public Health Services and Pan American Health Sanitary Bureau and the National Institutes of Health, headed to Guatemala in 1946 and found prostitutes who had syphilis. He then got them to give it to unsuspecting Guatemalan soldiers, mental health patients, and prisoners. They also directly infected certain individuals by, to quote Michael Cook from BioEdge, direct inoculations made from syphilis bacteria poured into the men's penises and on forearms and faces that were slightly abraded, or in a few cases, through spinal punctures. It isn't known how many people died as a result of this, as the results of the study were never published. By the way, Dr. John Cutler faced no consequences for the numerous people that died in his experiments, and even led an illustrious and celebrated career, including at one point being an assistant to the US Surgeon General. And now for another bonus fact. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and one of the symptoms is marks on the hands and the face of the infected person. These marks could often be found during this time on Catholic priests, cardinals, and the Pope. It showed that celibacy couldn't be policed and was not always followed. For reference, Catholic priests were first required to be celibate in 304 AD thanks to the Council of Elvira, which resulted in Canon 33 stating, "Bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and all other clerics must abstain completely from their wives." However, this wasn't widely adopted at the time, and it wasn't until the Second Lateran Council of 1139 when priests were forbidden to marry. In 1563, the Council of Trent once again affirmed this stance on celibacy and against marriage. The priests are still human, however. In perhaps one of our favorite quotes from the famed theologian Martin Luther, he stated, "Nature never lets up. We are all driven to the secret sin." To say it crudely, but honestly, if it doesn't go into a woman, it goes into your shirt. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. But if you're looking for something else to watch right now, why not check out a video from the archives linked to on the screen. And as always, Thank you for watching.
So the next topic we are going to talk about under that umbrella of human relations is harassment. And of course, harassment is something to be avoided. We cannot verbally, physically, sexually, or mentally harass participants during our research. We really want to be professional at all times and be on our best behavior. So we need to watch what we say, even if we're joking around. The APA says that psychologists do not knowingly engage in behavior that is harassing or demeaning to persons with whom they interact in their work based on factors such as those persons' age, gender, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, or socioeconomic status. So I'm going to show you a video of the Milgram experiment, which is, again, a very famous bit of research like the Stanford Prison Experiment. And they happened around the same time, both of which kind of led to the development of more strenuous and regulated ethical guidelines in our research. But the Milgram experiment sometimes is considered to be violating this rule of harassment. There was a lot of deception involved in the Milgram experiment. If you're not familiar with it, these people are believing that they are shocking another person to death in some cases upon the orders of someone they perceive to be an authority figure, which is just an actor in a lab coat, but they think it's an actual scientist. And so at any rate, the argument is that maybe there's some harassment there with the participants being kind of made to feel like they have no other option but to shock the people. Of course, they're not really shocking them, but they believe they're shocking them, and this is causing them to stress that they're harming another individual, but they kind of feel like they have to. So in a way, that might be a form of harassment. Also, it might be a little exploitative to have these actors in lab coats there that are portraying this image of, oh, I'm an authority figure, because we know in psychology that when people are in uniform, police uniforms or firefighter uniforms or even lab coats, doctor coats, people are going to be more inclined to do what they say, to follow their suggestions, because they perceive them as an authority. And, we've been trained since we were little kids to do what authority figures say. So some people argue that the Milgram experiment really violated the ethics, especially in regards to harassment and exploitation of being a person who is in power and kind of coercing someone else, in this case the participants, to shock someone else. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Milgram experiment, and you can kind of see for yourself if you think that this is a form of harassment and a violation of our ethical standards, which they didn't have then, but we have now. Okay, here we go.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area. They were obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. The subjects range in occupation from corporation presidents to good humor men and plumbers, and in educational level from one who had not finished elementary school to subjects who have doctorate and other professional degrees.
Right here. Now, both of you have been paid, so let me sit right down. So let me say that the checks are yours simply for showing up at the lab. And from this point on, no matter what happens, the money is yours. I should like to tell both of you a little about the Memory Project. Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn various types of material. Some of the better-known theories are treated in the book over there, The Teaching and Learning Process by Cantor. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. A common application of this theory would be when parents spank a child who does something wrong. But actually, we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning because almost no truly scientific studies have been made of it in human beings. For instance, we don't know how much punishment is best for learning. And we don't know how much difference it makes as to who's giving the punishment, whether an adult learns best from an older or a younger person himself, and many things of this sort. So what we're doing in the project is bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages, and we're asking some of them to be teachers and some to be learners. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher here this afternoon, and the other to be the learner. This machine generates electric shocks. When you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock. When you release it, the shock stops, you see, like that. The switch will remain in this middle position after you've released it to show you which switches you've used on the board. Of course, if you were to press any one of them again, the learner would get another shock.
All subjects are given identical instructions and a sample shock.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of volts you receive in the sample shock. Do not open your eyes until I tell you to do so, please. Close them now. Okay, you may open your eyes, and using the voltage scale here, would you estimate for me the number of volts you receive, please? You may also use the verbal designations, slight, moderate, strong, so forth, to help you. Say a number, please. Would you? About 75. 75. No, actually, it was 45 here. Although it may have seemed stronger because of the electrode paste, which provides a perfect contact. You see. All right, let's go on to our instructions. We will begin with this test. You will read each pair of words in this list once to the learner until you've read through the entire list. Direct your voice toward that microphone as the rooms are partially soundproof. After you've read through the list once, you will go on to the next page. And here, starting from line A, you'll read the word in large letters along with each of the other words in the line. For example, in the first line, you read blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Now, after you've read the four choices, the learner pushes one of the switches on the board in front of him, and the number he has selected will light up in this box, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, if he gives the correct answer, you say correct and go on to the next line. The correct answer is underlined and is also indicated in the right margin. Yeah. If he were to indicate the wrong answer, you would say wrong. Then tell him the number of volts you're going to give him. Then give him the punishment. Then read the correct word pair once, and then go on to the next line. For example, if he indicated 3 for blue, you would say wrong. 15 volts. You press and release the switch. Read blue girl, and then go on to the next line. I see. Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator. I see. And it's important that you follow this procedure exactly. So to help you, let me go through it again very quickly. All right. I would suggest you read the list and the test at a brisk pace to keep it moving.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The drawing was rigged so that the naive subject was always the teacher, and the accomplice always became the learner.
Well, of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end? And Mr. Wallace were out there, and say Mr. Williams, for some reason or other, said, keep going.
You're asking me how many people?
Out of 100, right.
Well, personally, I think, yeah, if you get 1 or 2, you'd be lucky.
Well, I'm not sure lucky is the right word.
40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school were also asked to predict the performance of 100 hypothetical subjects. They predicted that only a little more than 1/10 of 1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obeyed the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
165 volts. Time.
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know. They have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong.
I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
You can't stand it now. I'm not going to kill that man, there. You hear him hollering there? He's
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I'd refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. He's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and I mean, geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. I can't go on. He won't answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer. Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Grave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the experiment.
But what if something's happened to the man, had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must...
But he might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take this shock, sir.
Please
continue. I don't intend to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on him. All you got to do is look at the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving him, what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, 450 volts. Next one is short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time.
All right, excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may.
How do you feel, though?
I feel all right, but I don't like what's happened to that fellow in there. He's been howling, and we had to keep giving him shocks. I didn't like that one bit. I mean, he wanted to get out, and he just kept going, kept throwing 450 volts. I didn't like that. He wouldn't even look at on that gentleman.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said, he got to keep going. I told him it's time we stopped when we got up to 195, 210 volts.
Well, why didn't you just stop?
He wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop.
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
So one thing that Milgram did right in that experiment was that he didn't actually physically harm anyone, was shocking. But some people argue that maybe what he did wrong was cause people some mental or psychological harm. That would maybe mess you up a little bit if you were walking down the street, thought you were a normal person. Next minute, you're in a lab and you decide to shock someone to death. Now you're like, oh my God, am I a murderer? So that could be harmful mentally. The next subtopic of human relations we're going to focus on is avoiding harm. So the APA says psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, patients, students, supervisees, research participants, organizational clients, and others with whom they work, and to minimize harm where it is foreseeable and unavoidable. So you could see that this ethical standard is clearly an offshoot of Principle A, which was beneficence and non-maleficence. So we definitely don't want our participants to come out of our study feeling worse or being in worse condition than they were when they entered our study. But as you can see in the APA statement here, that latter part of the sentence, it says that, it basically implies that sometimes maybe in research there is going to be harm that is completely unavoidable. And in that case, what you should do is try to minimize the harm as much as possible. And so like we talked about before, ethics are subjective to a certain extent, and so there's a lot of stuff that kind of exists in the gray area. One of which is that false memory experiment that we had talked about earlier in the semester. So this experiment was done by Elizabeth Loftus, and it has been replicated a bunch. So just as a quick refresher, it's the one where she had participants' parents put memories in a journal. 2 were true and 1 was false, and then asked the participants if they remembered all of the stories in the journal, and of course in most cases they said yes, and even added their own details to them. And this kind of implied that there is such a thing as a false memory, or a memory that is constructed, and then you kind of convince yourself that that really happened. So a lot of people argue that this type of research is harmful to its participants. People can get very upset at the idea that their memory is not reliable. They feel like their brain has betrayed them in some way, and it can be psychologically kind of difficult for some participants to handle after the debriefing when they find out, that there was deception involved in the research and that their parents made up a story and all of that. So this is kind of one of those gray areas. Some people feel like this is a type of harm that could be avoided. Maybe there's a better way to do this type of research. And Elizabeth Loftus kind of argues that the benefits of the findings we get in this research greatly outweigh the damage that is done to the participants, by discovering that maybe their brain's less reliable than they thought it was. At any rate, if some potential harm is unavoidable, ask yourself, is this research design necessary? If no, see if you can redesign and focus more on beneficence. And if yes, then you need to have a really great debriefing. So you need to make sure that after the study you explain any potential harm, any deception, and you try to rectify it by offering counseling if needed, or therapy, or whatever type of treatment would kind of undo any harm that may have been caused by the experiment. Okay, so the next subtopic of human relations is relationships, and the APA says psychologists refrain from taking on a professional role when personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interests or relationships could reasonably be expected to impair the objectivity, competence, or effectiveness in performing their functions as a psychologist, or 2, expose the person or organization with whom the professional relationship exists to harm or exploitation. So researchers need to make sure to avoid conflict of interest. So if you are serving as a researcher, you can not also serve as a participant. For example, some students have run into this ethical conundrum in the past where they're in this class, but they're also in another psychology class where they're offered extra credit for participating in the surveys that this class is making, which obviously you cannot do that. You can't be involved in taking surveys that are created by your group. So researchers are not allowed to exploit people. They can't overstep their boundaries with, participants in the study, other researchers, lab techs, research assistants. They need to make sure that they are maintaining a professional relationship where everybody knows the role that they signed up for, and everyone is being treated in accordance. I recently saw a tweet from a college student that was taking a research class, and much like you guys, they were required to write their own research, but it was like a graduate program or something, so it was a little more advanced. They were working in smaller groups. There was like 3 or 4 people in the class, and the professor said that they had to put his name as the first author on any research that they published, although he was not involved in conducting the research whatsoever. So the first author of a research paper means that they are the person that did the most work. And a lot of people on Twitter, which I agreed with, were saying that that professor should not be on the paper at all. His name should not be listed as an author if he didn't do any work, and it certainly shouldn't be listed as the first author. And some people argued that that professor is exploiting the students by having them do work and then putting his name on it as if he did the work, and in this case, the majority of the work. Okay, so now we are moving on to the next ethical standard, privacy and confidentiality. Okay, so as researchers, maintaining confidentiality is super important. We want our participants to be anonymous whenever possible. I think in a broader sense, as social scientists and psychologists, we kind of want to go with an anonymous approach to the majority of the research so that when the general public comes into research, they have an expectation of anonymity. I think that helps us to kind of build trust with our participants and then, of course, get more valid and reliable data. So at any rate, we want to try to not use names of participants whenever possible. We don't want to know their name. We don't want to ask their name. We don't want to collect their name or any personally identifying information. If for some reason our research requires that we track data by participant, that we have to know something personally identifying about them, then what we would want to do is use a code or a key to identify that person rather than their actual name or their birth date or something like that. And then we would want to destroy the key when the experiment is over to ensure that that person's identity wouldn't get out. And then we always want to discuss confidentiality, again, to kind of instill that trust in us as researchers so people feel comfortable sometimes sharing what could be like their most, personal thoughts and feelings. They need to be confident that their identity is being withheld and that they are in fact anonymous. If there is a chance that confidentiality is at risk, you do have to tell the person those risks, and there are some rare circumstances where a person's identity or their data cannot be kept confidential. So even if I'm going to keep the person anonymous, but their data is going to be available, I need to make sure that I let people know that. So as an IO psychologist, if I go into a business and I know that the data I collect from the employees is going to be shown to managers or CEOs, I make sure to let the employees know that their data is going to be shown to their managers, just so there's full transparency and we're all honest about that. Of course, if their data was also not going to be anonymous, meaning that their identities were going to be revealed, I would certainly let them know that going into the study, like, hey, whatever you say about your boss is going to find out. Which, if I ever had to do that, I would be very concerned about the results that I was getting from those studies, because I know if I had to do an evaluation of somebody and my name was going to be used and that somebody was my boss and had control over my paycheck, I might not be as honest on that study as I would if I was anonymous. So we always have to disclose that kind of information. Also, if the data might be involved in a court case, there's a possibility that the person's anonymity would be revealed, so we would have to let them know that. But at any rate, the overall goal is to protect our participants from any type of harm. And so if we are going to be disclosing information about a client or a participant to someone else, we have to make sure we let the person know that. For example, if you go to a therapist, what you say during that session is confidential and it's private, and they are bound to not tell anyone what you say. However, they do have to disclose to you up front. A lot of therapy and psychiatry offices have signs up that say that if you are an immediate harm to yourself or someone else, they will have to disclose that to the appropriate authorities. But whatever the situation is, if you're collecting information on a person in a psychology format, whether it be therapy or research, and there is a chance that their identity or the information that they give you could be revealed, you have to disclose that to the person. Okay, so we have talked about the ethical standards for competence, which is basically stay in your lane. And we've talked about the ethical standards for human relations, which is basically be cool. And privacy and confidentiality ethical standards are basically keep the participants' identifying information and data on the down low. And now we are going to talk about how we apply all of these ethical standards and general principles for ethics to research and publication. So when we are doing research and publication, there are certain rules that we have to follow to keep us in line with the guidelines and ethical standards we've been discussing so far in this class. So when we're doing research, there are certain steps that we must go through. There are certain policies and rules and forms that must be created. There are certain behaviors that must be avoided. And so we're going to talk about all of that now. But, it applies to all researchers. So, the researchers that do it professionally at universities, and then us as students that are doing it for this class. So take good notes because you're going to be seeing these concepts more throughout the course of the semester as some of these materials we'll have to create for our research project. Okay, so the first ethical standard for research and publication is the institutional approval that is required to do research at an institution. So the APA says when institutional approval is required, psychologists provide accurate information about their research proposals and obtain approval prior to conducting the research. They conduct the research in accordance with the approved research protocol. So most universities and colleges have these institutional review boards or an IRB, and when you are going to be doing research on human participants, most of these institutions have a form that you have to fill out that includes everything you intend to do and how you intend to make sure that your research is in line with all of the ethical guidelines and standards laid out by the APA. So most colleges and universities have this IRB, which consists of a bunch of people that generally are experts in research or are very knowledgeable on research and work for the institution. I got my master's degree at Cal State San Bernardino, and I had to write a thesis which required me to do original research, and I had to submit an application to the IRB at Cal State San Bernardino, and a board of 5 people reviewed my application to make sure that it, again, adhered with the APA ethical standards, and I had to wait until I got approval before I was able to go ahead and start my research. And so this is kind of the standard operating procedure at most institutions. Sometimes if you submit an IRB application and it's incomplete or it doesn't check out, it doesn't line up with the ethical standards, then they will send it back to you and you'll have to resubmit until you kind of get it right. Or they can just flat out reject it and say, no, this is entirely unethical. You have to scrap it and start over. But at any rate, at the college, you do not have to submit to an IRB. I'm kind of acting as the IRB for this class because the research that we're doing is survey research and it's not very involved. There's really no risk of harm. It's safe for me to act as the IRB for our class. So you won't be submitting an IRB application, but I will be monitoring our research and making sure that we are in accordance with the APA ethical guidelines. All right, so we are required to create an informed consent and give it to our participants at the beginning of our research. So for this class, we're going to be writing a survey, and the very first page of the survey is going to be an informed consent. So an informed consent is required to let people know what is going to be done with their data, and inform them of everything that they're going to be involved in during the study, prior to the study. They need to give consent stating that they want to participate in the study, but that's not enough. They also need to be informed and acknowledge that they are informed about what the study consists of. So I am going to show you the story of Henrietta Lacks, who was not able to give informed consent, nor was her family or anyone else. And some people argue that this is unethical because when you see her story, you'll see that a lot of money was made off Henrietta Lacks, and no one, including her or anyone in her family, was able to participate in any of that income. And so we are going to watch that video to gain a better understanding of the importance of informed consent.
Imagine something small enough to float on a particle of dust that holds the keys to understanding cancer, virology, and genetics. Luckily for us, such a thing exists in the form of trillions upon trillions of human lab-grown cells called HeLa. Let's take a step back for a second. Scientists grow human cells in the lab to study how they function, understand how diseases develop, and test new treatments without endangering patients. To make sure that they can repeat these experiments over and over and compare the results with other scientists, they need huge populations of identical cells that can duplicate themselves faithfully for years. But until 1951, all human cell lines that researchers tried to grow had died after a few days. Then a Johns Hopkins scientist named George Guy received a sample of a strange-looking tumor. Dark purple, shiny, jelly-like. This sample was special. Some of its cells just kept dividing and dividing and dividing. When individual cells died, generations of copies took their place and thrived. The result was an endless source of identical cells that's still around today, the very first immortal human cell line. Guy labeled it HeLa after the patient with the unusual tumor, Henrietta Lacks. Born on a tobacco farm in Virginia, she lived in Baltimore with her husband and 5 children. She died of aggressive cervical cancer a few months after her tumor's cells were harvested, and she never knew about them. So what's so special about the cells from Henrietta Lacks that lets them survive when other cell lines die? The short answer is, we don't entirely know. Normal human cells have built-in control mechanisms. They can divide about 50 times before they self-destruct in a process called apoptosis. This prevents the propagation of genetic errors that creep in after repeated rounds of division. But cancer cells ignore these signals, dividing indefinitely and crowding out normal cells. Still, most cell lines eventually die off, especially outside the human body. Not HeLa, though, and that's the part we can't yet explain. Regardless, when Dr. Guy realized he had the first immortal line of human cells, he sent samples to labs all over the world. Soon the world's first cell production facility was churning out 6 trillion HeLa cells a week. And scientists put them to work, in an ethically problematic way, building careers and fortunes off of Henrietta's cells without her or her family's consent, or even knowledge until decades later. The polio epidemic was at its peak in the early 50s. HeLa cells, which easily took up and replicated the virus, allowed Jonas Salk to test his vaccine. They've been used to study diseases including measles, mumps, HIV, and Ebola. We know that human cells have 46 chromosomes because a scientist working with HeLa discovered a chemical that makes chromosomes visible. HeLa cells themselves actually have around 80 highly mutated chromosomes. HeLa cells were the first to be cloned. They've traveled to outer space. Telomerase, an enzyme that helps cancer cells evade destruction by repairing their DNA, was discovered first in HeLa cells. In an interesting turn of fate, thanks to HeLa, We know that cervical cancer can be caused by a virus called HPV, and now there's a vaccine. HeLa-fueled discoveries have filled thousands of scientific papers, and that number is probably even higher than anyone knows. HeLa cells are so resilient that they can travel on almost any surface. A lab worker's hand, a piece of dust, invading cultures of other cells and taking over like weeds. Countless cures, patents, and discoveries, all made thanks to Henrietta Lacks.
So an informed consent must include the following, and your informed consent that you write for your group's survey research will also include all of these items. So the first is the purpose of the research, and it's important to note that the purpose does not include the research hypothesis. We do not have to, nor should we tell our participants our exact hypothesis, because that can alter their behavior. They might give us responses that they think we want, rather than giving us the actual truthful responses. Or, there's some scoundrels out there that want to give the opposite of the answers that we want, and then they really mess us up. I mean, either way, it's bad. We want honest, truthful responses on our surveys. We don't want participants knowing our hypothesis and then altering their true responses in any way. So also, we need to include a right to decline, a statement about a right to decline or withdraw at any time. Participants are able to leave our study. They can X out of the survey right in the middle if at any point they feel uncomfortable, and that needs to be made very clear in the informed consent. I think that one's thanks to Zimbardo for sure, because those people in that Stanford prison experiment, a lot of them were not clear on the fact that they could just walk out at any time. The third thing that must be included in the informed consent is any consequences for declining or withdrawing. So this is like if you're, for example, taking a medication as part of a study and you decide to just stop participating, and so you no longer have access to that medication that you were taking. That might have adverse effects or be, negative, harmful to your health in some way. So we would need to let the participant know if there are any consequences for stopping the study, like halfway through or at any point. We need to include any risks, discomfort, or potential adverse effects that could result from participating in our study. Generally, in our class, we don't have any risks or discomfort. Sometimes if you're asking people questions about controversial issues like sex, I've had people put some type of disclaimer in there that you might be uncomfortable because we're going to ask you very personal questions about your attitudes on sex. So you can do that sort of thing in your informed consent if you think that there is potential for the person to feel kind of uncomfortable answering some of the questions on your survey, but that depends on the content of your survey. You need to include any prospective benefits in your informed consent. So if you think the person is likely to gain some self-awareness through answering your survey questions because it makes them be reflective, you might want to include that in your informed consent. Any limits of confidentiality, and then in general, just the idea that their responses will be confidential and their identities will be kept anonymous. It's so important to make that clear in the informed consent so that people feel comfortable providing us with honest answers. But, again, if you would have to disclose the information that you get to an employer or to a judge, you would need to include that in the informed consent. We don't really have very many limits to confidentiality here in our research project. And then any incentives for participation need to be listed in the informed consent. So the way that we are going to conduct our research is we are going to recruit people through their psychology professors. So I will be forwarding the survey links that you create to the psychology professors in the department, and then they will be disseminating those to their students, and that's how we will get our participants. The professors may or may not decide to give the students extra credit for participating in our research. In my experience, most of them have and always do. So we would put that on our informed consent as that there is a possibility that the incentive for this participation is going to be extra credit, but that the participant would need to talk to their professor about that to verify. And then finally, we need to include who the participants can contact to get the results of the study, or if they have been harmed in any way by the study and they need resources like the contact information of a therapist, for example, we would need to include that information in our informed consent. So for this class, you can let the participants know that they can contact me at my email address, and that will fulfill that obligation of the informed consent. So a couple other notes for the informed consent. We need to make sure that there is a place for the participants to indicate that they have received the consent form and that they understand the conditions of the study. So this can be a checkbox. Since our surveys are going to be done online, they will need to check a box that says that they have received the informed consent and that they understand and that they wish to continue with the study. And then we should make it so they are unable to proceed with the survey if they have not consented by clicking or checking a box. And then we also want to make sure that we write the consent form at a grade like 6 to 8 level so that the participants can understand. We don't want our participants to be confused at any point during our research because that could hinder their ability to give truthful answers. And if it's necessary, if it's appropriate, we want to explain how our participants are selected. Generally in this class, that's not necessary because everybody is pretty clear on how they were selected. They volunteer. They were notified by their psychology instructor of this study. And that is the way we recruit for this study. But sometimes it's important to include how the participants were selected, especially if the nature of the study might make people think that they were selected because they're unusual. Like, we're only looking for people to participate in our study that, you know, eat purple grapes exclusively and wear sun hats all the time. You know, if that were the case, we would want to let them know that that's why they were selected. But for our purposes, again, it's not going to be necessary. It is necessary for our purposes, since we're going to be doing an online survey, to include in the informed consent the expected length of time that it should take the participant to complete the survey. So generally this should be like 10 to 15 minutes. Any longer than that, and usually people don't want to participate, or they just don't give truthful answers. They become acquiescent or bored and they just start clicking whatever random answer they want. So we want to make sure we set a realistic expectation of the time that it will take to complete the survey. And also, the informed consent should be as short as possible without leaving out any of this information. You don't want it to be longer than a page for sure. Okay, so that is the informed consent, and you will be creating one of these in the near future. So the next ethical standard as it applies to research and publication has to do with offering inducements. So the APA states that psychologists should make reasonable efforts to avoid offering excessive or inappropriate financial or other inducements for research participation when such inducements are likely to coerce participation. So inducements are like prizes, money. In our case, it's extra credit. It's any incentive we give to the participants in an effort to, get them to take our survey or participate in our study. And so we want to make sure that we avoid inducements that would be so enticing that someone that really doesn't want to participate in our study becomes kind of coerced into it. They feel as though they can't resist. The incentive is too large. So we want to make sure that the incentives are reasonable enough for a person to go, you know what, I really don't feel comfortable participating in that study, so I'm not going to do it. But they're not too large that the person is like, well, I make $20,000 a year, and you're offering me $10,000 to participate in this study where I take a new drug. I'd really rather not take a new drug that I don't know is safe or not, but I really need that $10,000, so I'm going to do that drug. So we can't do that. Obviously, people could take advantage of a system where you could, exploit people's poverty by giving them large inducements to participate in dangerous studies, right? So we need to make sure that the incentives we offer people for participating in our study are reasonable, that a person could reasonably walk away from them and wouldn't feel coerced into doing something they don't want to do. All right, so the next ethical standard for research and publication refers to deception in research. So we do want to try avoid using deception unless it's completely necessary. Like we talked about before, we want people to trust psychologists, so deception is a last resort. Although it's interesting because most people seem to think that deception in psychology research is the norm, when really we try to avoid it at all costs so that we don't hinder people's trust in us as researchers. But sometimes we have to use deception because maybe the nature of our research question warrants that. For example, when we ask people about biases they hold, like racist biases, for example, they tend to not be honest about their opinions and perspectives. So sometimes we might have to come up with creative ways to kind of get to the truth about that, and that can involve some deception. So if we do deception, we have to tell the participants in the debriefing, which is at the end of data collection, and we have to tell them immediately after. And in that debriefing, we need to explain why the deception was necessary, and we need to try to put the participants at ease about it. We don't want them to leave feeling upset that they had been deceived. We also, in the debriefing, whenever we use deception, we have to provide the participants with an opportunity to have their data removed. If they feel offended that they were deceived, they might want to have their data removed and request that, and we absolutely have to comply. They may get upset about the way they behaved during the study and want their data removed because of that. So there's been some instances where people have been part of research on helping behavior and they have not helped, and then when they were told in the debriefing that the research was on helping behavior and they didn't help, sometimes they get upset about that and they want their data removed. So when we use deception in research, we need to be honest in the debriefing and offer for people to have their data removed, but of course we want to try to minimize the use of deception as much as possible. But before we move on, I want to show you a quick clip of a study done by Solomon Asch on conformity, and he does use deception. Everybody in the study is an actor. They're in on it with the researcher, except for the actual participant. So as you'll see, the people are all asked to compare two lines and say if they're the same size, if one's longer, one's shorter. And all of the actors are told to give incorrect answers to see if the true participant will go along with it, if they'll conform, even though, the answer is obviously wrong. So conformity studies like this sometimes do cause a little harm in the participant in that they get embarrassed that they conformed or that they kind of got tricked, and so they might ask to have their data removed just because they're embarrassed. But at any rate, here is the example of deception in research.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2,
2,
3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1,
1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2.
1. 2. 2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
2.
2.
2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1.
2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
Okay, so you've heard me mention the debriefing a few times, and this is also a requirement in research and a requirement of your project for this class. So a debriefing can be verbal or written. For our research, since we're doing ours as an online study, it will be written, and it appears at the very end of your survey or your questionnaire. So there's a few things that every debriefing has to have. The first of which is a statement that says participants can contact a person, and in this case that will be me, to gain further information about the study or the findings of the study. The second thing that all debriefings must have is a disclosure if deception was used, or you can use that space to address any questions about misconceptions that the participants may have regarding the research. So if you anticipate that people might have been tricked a little or confused, you can kind of clarify any of that in your debriefing. But certainly if you did deceive the people in your research, you have to make sure that you include a statement on that deception. And then the third thing that you must include is if a participant has potentially been harmed or could have been harmed by participating in your research, then you must leave a statement there with a reference to a clinician or a statement that you can provide assistance by getting a clinician or a therapist or a counselor or somebody to discuss what happened with the participant and attempt to rectify the situation. And that, of course, would have to be free of charge for that participant. All right, so when it comes to reporting your research, so you have finished all your research and you're reporting it probably because you want it to get published in a scholarly journal. There are some ethical standards for that as well. The first of which is do not fabricate data. So if at any point you as a researcher realize that you made errors in your procedure and your calculation and your findings and your reportings, you must take action to correct or retract it, even if no one else has seen it, even if you're the only one that knows. So this is so important because research builds on previous findings. So if you report inaccurate results, it can really set the field back. It wastes time, it wastes resources. So you may have heard of this guy before that you see on your screen. His name's Andrew Wakefield, and in 1998 he reported a link between vaccination and autism, but the findings were not able to be replicated. They were never able to be replicated, and eventually they were determined false because he admitted that he made up the entire study. He never even did the study, and still to this day people cite his study that he never actually did as a reason to not vaccinate their children. So there's a lot of danger that can be involved with reporting research inaccurately or incorrectly. And so even if it's a mistake, you must make sure that you report any mistakes or make any corrections to your research. All right, so we are going to talk about plagiarism more in the lab, but briefly, the APA cites that psychologists do not present portions of another's work or data as their own, even if the other work or data source is cited occasionally. So, in other words, a lot of people plagiarize unintentionally. It's an accident, but if you plagiarize accidentally, you're still responsible for plagiarizing. So be aware that ignorance does not excuse academic dishonesty or plagiarism in the workplace or in an organization. Even if you cite the work in one part of your paper, but then you state another different idea from an article, you need to cite it again. You need to cite every time that you propose an idea that's not yours, that's someone else's. And another thing you can do to help with plagiarism is to paraphrase instead of quoting. Again, I'll discuss more of this in the lab with you this week, but I only allow you to have one quote for your entire big old paper that you're writing for this class, and that is in part to help you not unintentionally plagiarize. So when you're paraphrasing, you cite. When you're quoting, you're only allowed that one, the whole paper, and it can't be a block quote, which is 40 words or more. It has to be a little quote. You only get one. And the rest of your paper should be paraphrased and still cited with where you got the idea from to avoid plagiarism. Okay, and then in terms of internet research, I just wanted to highlight this because this is the type of research that we will be doing. There are ethical problems that do exist for online surveys, and we have to do our best to follow the guidelines stated in this lecture so we don't violate any ethical standards or guidelines. But some of the problems that exist are, first of all, with the informed consent. We can't really ensure that people actually read and understand it. So the best we can do there is have that box that they have to check that says they read it. Another potential ethical problem is with the debriefing. So the participants can't directly ask the researcher questions when we are conducting our research online. And so what we can do to try to rectify that situation is include an email or other contact information in the debriefing statement so that the participants have someone to reach out to if they have questions. Again, for our research, that's going to be my email address. And then the third kind of potential ethical problem is confidentiality. So we can't really, truly, actually guarantee that a person's computer won't be hacked or their responses are completely safe. All computers have their own kind of little identifying addresses, IP addresses and stuff that people could use to find out what data, they gave, including whatever information they gave on a survey. However, the likelihood of that is very low, so we don't usually worry our participants with that information. But these are some of the ethical concerns that researchers have mentioned in the past with internet research. So we just want to do our best to be mindful of them and provide any kind of corrections that we can so that nothing unethical is occurring. All right, and that is it for Chapter 3. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.